Freedom is a word that echoes through human history. It inspires revolutions and shapes societies. But what does it truly mean to be free? The answer often depends on where you look. In the modern world, two major traditions offer powerful yet different visions of liberty: the Western tradition and the Islamic tradition. Both seek to liberate human beings, but they start from different places and aim for different goals. Understanding these two paths is crucial in our interconnected world, where these ideas often meet, clash, and sometimes find surprising common ground. They are not simple opposites, but complex systems of thought that have evolved over centuries. The Western concept of freedom, as many know it today, places the individual at its very center. It champions the right to choose one's own path, to speak one's mind, and to live without undue interference from the state or any other authority. This idea is deeply rooted in a history that includes Greek democracy, the Roman concept of the citizen, and the transformative thinking of the Enlightenment. It is a story of breaking away from old constraints, whether they were monarchies or rigid religious doctrines, to create a space where personal autonomy could flourish. This vision has given the world declarations of human rights and democratic constitutions, shaping nations across the globe. In contrast, the Islamic concept of freedom begins not with the individual alone, but with the individual's relationship with God, Allah. True freedom in this view is not the absence of all constraints, but the liberation from the tyranny of our own base desires, social pressures, and false idols. It is the freedom found in submitting to a higher divine law, which is seen as just, compassionate, and liberating. This submission is not meant to be a form of enslavement, but a path to freeing the human spirit from the chaos of a life without purpose. The goal is to achieve a state of inner peace and justice by aligning one's will with the divine will. These two grand narratives of freedom are not just abstract philosophies. They have profound real-world consequences. They influence laws, social norms, and international relations. They determine how societies handle issues like free speech, religious expression, and the responsibilities we have to one another. By exploring their origins, their core principles, and how they are practiced today, we can move beyond simplistic stereotypes. We can begin to appreciate the deep human yearning for liberation that animates both traditions and understand why the dialogue between them is one of the most important conversations of our time. The Western idea of freedom has a long and winding history, with roots stretching back to the ancient world. In the city-states of ancient Greece, particularly Athens, the concept of eleutheria, or liberty, was born. For the Greeks, this meant the right of citizens to participate in political life and not be subject to the arbitrary rule of a tyrant. The philosopher Aristotle connected freedom with self-rule, arguing that a free person is one who lives as he likes. This early political freedom was not for everyone. It excluded women, slaves, and foreigners. But it planted a seed, the idea that a government's legitimacy comes from the consent of its citizens, not from divine right. Centuries later, the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries dramatically reshaped this idea. Thinkers like John Locke argued that individuals possess natural rights, including life, liberty, and property. These rights were not granted by a king or a government. They were inherent to being human. Locke's powerful idea was that governments are formed to protect these rights, and if they fail, the people have the right to change them. This was a revolutionary shift. It placed the individual, armed with inalienable rights, at the heart of the political universe. Freedom was no longer just about participating in government. It was about protecting a private sphere where the individual was sovereign. This focus on individual rights fueled the great democratic revolutions of the modern era, including the American and French revolutions. The U.S. Declaration of Independence famously declared that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, echoing Locke's philosophy. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen defined liberty as the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. These documents codified the principles of individual freedom, free speech, and equality before the law, making them the cornerstones of modern Western democracies. They created a framework where freedom was a legal and political reality, not just a philosophical dream. Today, this tradition continues to evolve, shaped by ongoing debates about the meaning and limits of individual liberty. The core principle, however, remains deeply ingrained. Freedom is fundamentally about personal autonomy and the protection of individual rights against external power. It is the right to choose your own beliefs, express your own opinions, and pursue your own version of a good life, as long as you do not harm others. This powerful vision has become a global standard, influencing human rights movements and international law, and continues to inspire people fighting for liberation around the world. The Islamic understanding of freedom, or hurriya, is profoundly theological, flowing directly from its core beliefs about God, humanity, and the purpose of life. Its foundation lies in the Quran, Islam's holy book, and the Sunnah, the example of the Prophet Muhammad. The starting point is the concept of Tawheed, the absolute oneness of God. Because God is the only true sovereign, no human being, no king, priest, or state has the right to demand absolute obedience from another. This principle is inherently liberating. It frees the individual from servitude to any earthly power and redirects their ultimate allegiance to a single, just, and merciful Creator. In the Islamic worldview, every human being is born in a state of natural purity and freedom, known as the fitrah. The Quran teaches that God honored the children of Adam and made them his vicegerents, or stewards, khalifa, on earth. This is a position of great dignity and responsibility. It implies that humans are endowed with reason, free will, and the capacity to choose between right and wrong. The Quran states, "There is no compulsion in religion," a verse often cited to support the idea that faith must be a free and conscious choice, not something forced upon a person. True faith, therefore, can only come from a place of inner freedom. This freedom, however, is not without purpose or direction. It is guided by the Sharia or divine law. Many in the West view Sharia as a rigid set of restrictive rules, but in its classical understanding, it is a comprehensive ethical framework designed to protect human well-being. Its objectives, known as the Maqasid al-Sharia, include the preservation of faith, life, intellect, family, and property. From this perspective, the laws of Sharia are not meant to limit freedom, but to create a just society where true human flourishing is possible. They provide boundaries that prevent freedom from descending into chaos and protect the vulnerable from the powerful. Thus, freedom in Islam is best understood as a purposeful liberty. It is the freedom to become the best version of oneself by living in accordance with divine guidance, rather than simply the freedom from external constraints. It is a spiritual journey of liberating the self from the ego, greed, and social pressures that can enslave the human spirit. The ultimate goal is to achieve a state of inner peace and submission to God's will, which is seen as the highest form of freedom. This concept challenges the purely individualistic models of liberty and proposes a vision where freedom and responsibility are deeply intertwined. In the 20th century, the Western debate about freedom was famously clarified by the philosopher Isaiah Berlin, who distinguished between two powerful concepts: negative and positive liberty. Understanding this distinction is key to grasping the nuances of Western thought. Negative freedom is likely the more familiar concept. It is freedom from interference. This type of liberty is concerned with creating a protected space around the individual where no one, especially the government, can intrude. It asks the question, what is the area within which the subject, a person or group of persons, is or should be left to do or be what he is able to do or be without interference by other persons? This idea of negative liberty is the bedrock of classical liberalism and libertarianism. It champions individual rights such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the right to privacy. The U.S. Constitution's Bill of Rights is a classic example of protecting negative freedoms. It lists things the government cannot do, such as restricting speech or establishing a religion. The philosopher John Stuart Mill, in his book On Liberty, provided a powerful defense of this idea. He argued that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community, against his will, is to prevent harm to others. Beyond that, the individual should be free to think, live, and act as they see fit. Positive freedom, on the other hand, is a more complex and sometimes controversial idea. It is not just about being left alone. It is about having the capacity and resources to fulfill one's potential. It is the freedom to act and to be the master of one's own destiny. This concept asks the question, what or who is the source of control or interference that can determine someone to do or be this rather than that? A person might be free from external constraints, negative liberty, but still be unfree if they are trapped by poverty, lack of education, or poor health. They lack the positive power to achieve their goals. This vision of positive liberty has inspired social, democratic, and progressive movements. Proponents argue that true freedom requires more than just the absence of barriers. It requires a supportive society that provides everyone with the tools they need to succeed. This can mean public education, universal healthcare, and a social safety net. However, critics like Berlin warned that the pursuit of positive liberty could be dangerous. It could be used to justify authoritarianism, where a state claims to know what is best for its citizens and forces them to be free in a particular way, even against their own declared wishes. This tension between negative and positive freedom remains a central debate in Western politics today. In Islamic thought, freedom is intricately linked to the concept of living within divine boundaries. This is not seen as a contradiction, but as the very condition for authentic liberty. The Quran and the teachings of the Prophet provide a framework, the Sharia, which is understood as a gift from a merciful God to guide humanity towards justice and flourishing. True freedom is achieved by aligning one's choices with this divine moral compass. The Quran says, "And whoever obeys God and his messenger has certainly achieved a great attainment." Chapter 33, verse 71. This great attainment is not just a heavenly reward, but also the earthly experience of living a purposeful and liberated life. This idea can be understood through the concept of, or the servant of God. In a secular context, being a servant sounds like the opposite of freedom. But in the Islamic spiritual context, it means being a servant to God, which liberates a person from servitude to everything else: wealth, power, societal expectations, and one's own ego. The Sufi poet Rumi beautifully captured this idea of spiritual liberation, describing the journey of the soul as breaking free from the prison of the self to unite with the divine. This internal freedom is considered more profound than any external political liberty, as it addresses the root of human suffering and confusion. The limits set by Sharia are therefore seen as protective, not punitive. They are like the banks of a river that allow the water to flow powerfully in a clear direction. Without them, the water would dissipate into a stagnant swamp. For example, the prohibition of intoxicants is intended to free the mind from addiction and preserve the intellect, which is considered a sacred gift from God. The rules governing economic transactions are designed to prevent exploitation and free society from the injustices of usury and greed. As the scholar Tariq Ramadan explains, the whole of the Islamic legislation on society, on justice, on equality, on rights, is to protect the human being against any kind of alienation. This framework naturally leads to a strong emphasis on social responsibility. An individual's freedom is not absolute, but is balanced by the rights of the community. The Islamic tradition stresses the importance of caring for the poor, upholding justice, and enjoining what is right while forbidding what is wrong. This collective duty ensures that the pursuit of individual liberty does not lead to social harm or neglect of the vulnerable. Freedom, therefore, is not just a personal right but a communal trust. It is the liberty to build a just and compassionate society in which every individual is dignified and protected within the embrace of divine guidance. The Charlie Hebdo affair in France provides a stark case study of the clash between Western ideals of free speech and Islamic sensitivities. In 2015, the satirical magazine published cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad, an act protected under France's robust tradition of secularism, what they call, and freedom of expression. From a Western perspective rooted in negative liberty, the right to satirize, criticize, and even offend religious figures is a cornerstone of a free society. It's seen as a vital check on dogma and power. However, for many Muslims, the caricatures were not just offensive, but a profound act of blasphemy and disrespect, attacking the most sacred symbol of their faith. This tragic event really highlighted the deep chasm between a concept of freedom as absolute expression and a concept of freedom that includes respect for the sacred. In Pakistan, the case of Asia Bibi, a Christian woman sentenced to death for blasphemy, illustrates a very different approach. Pakistan's blasphemy laws, which criminalize any insult to Islam, are rooted in the idea that the state has a duty to protect the honor of the religion. From this perspective, certain speech is so harmful to social order and religious peace that it must be prohibited. This reflects a view where communal harmony and religious sanctity can override an individual's right to expression. While Asia Bibi was eventually acquitted by the Supreme Court in 2018 after years in prison, her case sparked violent protests and highlighted the intense debate within Muslim-majority countries. It showed the tension between state-enforced religious protection and the rights of religious minorities and individual conscience. A more mixed and evolving model can be seen in Tunisia following its 2011 revolution. The new Tunisian constitution, adopted in 2014, is a fascinating attempt to bridge Western and Islamic ideas. It guarantees freedom of belief, conscience, and religious practice, reflecting modern human rights norms. At the same time, it states that the state is the guardian of religion and obligates it to protect the sacred. This creates a delicate balance. The constitution tries to protect individual liberties while also acknowledging the country's Islamic identity and the importance of religion in public life. Tunisia's ongoing journey shows that a simple binary of Western freedom versus Islamic restriction is too simple. It represents a living experiment in crafting a unique model of liberty that is both democratic and culturally authentic. These three cases reveal that the application of freedom is far from straightforward. France's model prioritizes secular individualism, sometimes at the cost of religious feelings. Pakistan's model prioritizes religious honor, sometimes at the cost of individual liberty and minority rights. Tunisia represents a complex negotiation, attempting to hold both values in a fragile balance. They show that abstract principles of freedom are always interpreted and applied within specific cultural, political, and historical contexts. The real-world challenges lie not in the theories themselves, but in how societies navigate the tensions between individual rights, communal responsibilities, and the sacred. When we place the Western and Islamic traditions of freedom side by side, several key differences in their foundational principles become clear. Perhaps the most fundamental distinction lies in the source of authority. In the modern Western tradition, particularly after the Enlightenment, ultimate authority rests with human reason and the individual. Freedom is a natural right, and laws are legitimate only if they are derived from the consent of the governed. The individual is the sovereign who decides their own moral code. As U.S. Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote, "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life." In contrast, the Islamic tradition places ultimate authority and sovereignty with God. Human beings are granted freedom as a trust, what's called. But this freedom is to be exercised within the moral and legal framework revealed by God. The source of law and morality is not individual preference or social consensus, but divine revelation found in the Quran and Sunnah. This does not eliminate human reason. Rather, Islamic jurisprudence involves a rigorous intellectual process of interpreting these sources to apply them to new contexts. However, the foundational premise remains that true law and ultimate goodness originate from a source higher than humanity. This difference in authority leads to different views on individual rights and their limits. In the West, rights are often seen as absolute and inherent to the individual, with the primary limit being the harm principle, as articulated by John Stuart Mill. One's freedom extends until it begins to infringe upon the freedom of another. The focus is on protecting the individual from external coercion. In Islam, rights are also deeply valued, but they are always balanced with duties. An individual's right to freedom is connected to their responsibility to God, their family, and their community. The limits on freedom are therefore broader, including not just preventing harm to others, but also upholding moral virtues, protecting the community's well-being, and showing reverence for the sacred. Despite these significant differences, it is a mistake to see these traditions as entirely alien to each other. Both traditions, at their best, seek to liberate human beings from tyranny and oppression. Both value justice, compassion, and the sanctity of human life. Both traditions have internal debates about the right balance between individual liberty and social order. The Western tradition grapples with the tension between negative and positive liberty, while the Islamic tradition has ongoing discussions about how to interpret divine law in a way that promotes justice and freedom in the modern world. They are two different languages for expressing a universal human aspiration. Both the Western and Islamic traditions are not static relics of the past. They are living, breathing systems of thought animated by vibrant internal debates and calls for reform. In the West, the conversation about freedom continues to evolve, pushing beyond classical definitions. Thinkers in the critical theory tradition, for example, argue that true freedom requires dismantling subtle systems of power, such as systemic racism, patriarchy, and economic inequality that limit people's life chances even in societies that formally protect their rights. They challenge the idea that negative liberty is sufficient, pointing out how social structures can be just as coercive as an authoritarian government. Another major debate in the West revolves around the limits of free speech in the digital age. The rise of social media has created new challenges, from the spread of misinformation and hate speech to online harassment. This has led to difficult questions. Should tech companies have the power to censor content? How can societies protect free expression without allowing their digital public squares to become toxic? These debates show that the Western concept of freedom is constantly being renegotiated as technology and society change, forcing a re-evaluation of old principles like Mill's harm principle in a world where harm can be inflicted indirectly and at a massive scale. Within the Islamic world, there is a powerful and diverse movement of reformist thinkers who are re-examining traditional interpretations of Sharia to better align them with modern concepts of freedom and human rights. Scholars like Abdullahi Ahmed an-Na'im argue for a distinction between the universal ethical message of the Quran and the historical laws of the Medinan period. He proposes that Muslims should base their public law on modern constitutionalism and human rights, which he sees as compatible with the Quran's core values of justice and compassion. These thinkers are not seeking to abandon their faith, but to interpret it in a way that speaks to the challenges of the 21st century. Similarly, feminist Islamic scholars such as Amina Wadud and Asma Barlas are challenging patriarchal interpretations of the Quran. They argue that the text, when read holistically and in its historical context, promotes gender equality and justice. They advocate for a rereading of scripture that empowers women and affirms their full rights and freedoms within an Islamic framework. These reformist voices, though often facing strong opposition from conservative establishments, are crucial. They demonstrate that the Islamic tradition, like the Western one, possesses the intellectual resources for self-critique and renewal, striving to articulate a vision of freedom that is both authentic to its roots and viable for the future. In our deeply interconnected yet often polarized world, understanding the different ways that Western and Islamic traditions conceive of freedom is more than an academic exercise. It is a vital necessity for fostering mutual respect, effective diplomacy, and peaceful coexistence. When we fail to grasp the deep philosophical and spiritual roots of these different visions, we fall into the trap of simplistic and dangerous stereotypes, the West as a beacon of liberty versus Islam as a monolith of oppression. This caricature ignores the rich diversity and ongoing debates within both traditions and prevents any meaningful dialogue from taking place. Recognizing the different starting points, the sovereign individual in the West and the sovereign God in Islam, allows us to understand why certain issues like free speech or the role of religion in public life are so contentious. It helps explain why a call for freedom can sound inspiring to one person and threatening to another. For a Westerner, it might mean the freedom to critique and question everything. For a Muslim, it might mean the freedom to live a life of piety without being subject to secular pressures or colonial interference. Acknowledging the validity of both aspirations is the first step toward finding common ground. Furthermore, engaging with both traditions can enrich our own understanding of freedom. The Western focus on individual rights has been a powerful force against tyranny, but it can sometimes lead to excessive individualism and a breakdown of community. The Islamic emphasis on responsibility and divine guidance offers a potent reminder that freedom is not just about the self, but about our connection to others and to a higher purpose. Each tradition can serve as a mirror to the other, highlighting its strengths while also revealing its potential blind spots. A West that appreciates the value of community and a Muslim world that embraces individual rights could both become stronger and more just. Ultimately, the human quest for freedom is universal. It is a journey with many paths, not just one. The Western path, paved with the stones of reason and rights, and the Islamic path, illuminated by the light of revelation and submission, both aim to elevate the human condition. In the 21st century, the great challenge is not to prove one path superior to the other, but to build bridges of understanding between them. By listening to each other with empathy and intellectual honesty, we can better appreciate the complex, beautiful, and sometimes difficult ways that humanity has sought to answer one of its oldest questions: what does it truly mean to be free?